Currently, Pau Gasol is regarded as one of the greatest European players to ever step into the NBA, a name tied to milestones that not many outside the United States have reached. Two NBA championships with the Los Angeles Lakers in the 2009 and 2010 seasons, 6 times selected as an NBA All-Star, the Rookie of the Year award in 2002 with the Memphis Grizzlies, more than 20,000 points scored in the toughest league on the planet, and a key role in a Lakers dynasty where every game was scrutinized under the microscope of history. At the national team level, Pau was the soul of Spain's golden generation. World Cup champion in 2006, three-time Eurobasket champion, 2 Olympic silver medals in 2008 and 2012, 1 Olympic bronze medal in 2016, along with a series of individual honors that made him an icon of modern European basketball. His jersey hangs permanently at Staples Center. Teammates call him the ideal teammate, and American experts admit that Pau Gasol changed how they view European players. No longer soft role players, but pillars capable of carrying championship dreams. From the outside, it looks like a perfect journey, where talent is rewarded, where a career is sealed with championship rings, titles, and near absolute respect. But behind that dazzling resume is another life, another half of the man that for 30 years Pau Gasol had to hide like something forbidden. It is the pain of a body worn down day by day in silence, of a mind that understands injury mechanisms very well, understands every accumulating damage in bones and joints, but still has to step onto the court as if there were no other choice. It is the loneliness of a person carrying intellect, compassion, and kindness in a world that worships aggression, where silence is often mistaken for weakness and yielding is seen as lacking guts. Pau lived 2 lives not because he wanted to, but because he had to, in order to survive. A warrior on the court ready to collide, sacrifice, and step back so the team could win, and an inner human who always had to suppress emotions, hide doubts, nameless pains, questions about his own worth. Each title came with a piece of himself traded away. Each round of applause passed, leaving an emptiness no one saw. And Pau's true willpower lay not in clutch shots or championship rings, but in standing firm for 3 decades between 2 opposing selves, continuing to move forward, even knowing the price was never being able to live fully as his true self. If you want to continue exploring the untold truths about Pau Gasol's life, the things behind the titles, the lights, and the historical numbers, please hit subscribe to the channel to join us in the next part. Born into a family where science and medicine were not just professions but standards of living, Pau Gasol entered life, not with fairy tales or the indulgence often seen in a gifted athletic child, but with rules of silence, unspoken expectations that were always present in every meal, every question, every glance from his parents. His father was a nurse, his mother a doctor. Both believed in discipline, in correctness, in controlling oneself before thinking of conquering the world, and in that environment, Pau grew up in very real but very tight love, where emotions were valued but rarely allowed to spill out. No one in the family taught him that weakness was wrong, but no one gave him the feeling that he had the right to be weak either, because from very early on, Pau was seen as a sensible child, an older brother who had to set an example, had to yield, had to self-restrain, had to stand tall, even when tired. In that house, they talked a lot about the human body, biological limits, responsibility to oneself and others, and Pau absorbed it all as natural, to the point where he learned to hide his fatigue not out of fear of punishment, but because he didn't want to disappoint anyone. Pau's intellect blossomed very early, not just in studies, but in how he observed the world, in the questions he asked about life, pain, death, and the bitter paradox was that this very intelligence, which should have been a gift, gradually became a burden when he stepped into the sports world, where raw strength was often praised more than empathy, where silence was misinterpreted as lacking fire, and deep thinking seen as hesitation. While other kids were allowed to cry, to rebel, to make mistakes, Pau learned to self-correct, to be right, to adjust himself to fit, to swallow emotions he knew were real but inconvenient to show because he was the oldest, the one his siblings looked to, the family's pride. Proof that discipline and character could coexist with talent. He loved basketball, but he was never allowed to love it as carefree play. From the start, it was responsibility, a path, something to do right, fully, worthily of the sacrifices around him. In those years, Pau lacked no love, but lacked space for fragility, a place to be an ordinary child with irrational anger, unexplained tears, mistakes not remembered. He learned to be calm beyond his age, mature beyond his age, and that early maturity planted in him a silent tragedy. When never allowed to be weak, a person also doesn't learn how to heal themselves. Pau carried that lesson through the later years, from small training courts in Spain to the massive NBA arenas, where every collision, every doubt, every misunderstanding rekindled the old feeling that he had no right to fall, that if he stopped, if he complained, if he showed fatigue, not only his career, but the image of the person he'd built since childhood would collapse. Pau Gasol's original tragedy wasn't poverty or lack of opportunity, but growing up in a world where everything was in place, on time, to standard, leaving no room for very human deviation, and from there, he entered life with heavy baggage, talent, intellect, morals, and an invisible but never-off reminder that he was not allowed to be weak, not allowed to fail, and perhaps not allowed to be an ordinary child, even when his heart craved it more than anything. The early years wearing Barcelona's jersey brought Pau Gasol what many kids dream of: titles, recognition, the feeling of being on the right chosen path. But the more solidly he stood in the European basketball system, the more Pau felt a vague unease he couldn't name, as if success came too early and too orderly, making him no longer know the boundary between passion and duty. At Barcelona, he was protected, understood, played basketball that valued intellect and connection. But right there, Pau began to sense that the world he lived in might be too small compared to the expectations his talent brought, and that if he stayed, he would forever be a safe version of himself, loved but never challenged to the limit. The decision to go to the NBA didn't come like a glittering American dream, but like a voluntary exile, a cold severance from family, language, culture, and identity that had nurtured him since childhood, because Pau understood that this step meant tearing himself away from the only place he'd ever felt safe. The day he left Spain, he took no more than a suitcase and a fragile belief that he could adapt. But what he didn't foresee was the helplessness from not being able to express himself in words when every thought got stuck in his head due to the language barrier, when every locker room joke became a lonely silence, and every tactical instruction came with fear of misunderstanding. In that new world, Pau became more observer than participant, listening more than speaking, nodding more than arguing, and that silence gradually got interpreted as lacking confidence, lacking fire, lacking personality, while inside him was a storm of thoughts that never stopped. Loneliness didn't come from having no one around, but from no one truly understanding what he was thinking, what he feared, and what he was losing, as days passed without recognizing himself in the mirror. Pau soon realized a cruel truth. The NBA doesn't wait for those who need time, and if he didn't change, didn't make himself tougher, louder, rougher, he would be crushed not by opponents, but by the merciless pace of the league itself. From that moment, the second life began to form painfully, when Pau had to learn to adjust every gesture, every reaction, every emotional expression to fit an environment unforgiving of fragility, and each adaptation was also one more step back for his old self. He still carried the values taught by his family, still believed in kindness and responsibility, but now they were compressed under a survival shell, where the top priority was no longer becoming a whole person, but surviving long enough to prove he deserved to be there. Pau Gasol's first exile wasn't marked by loud tragedy or public failure, but by long, lonely nights, silent meals, training sessions, where he had to remind himself that if he didn't lose part of his old self, he couldn't keep any part in this new world. And from there, leaving Spain wasn't just a career turning point, but the start of a decades-long process of eroding his identity. Upon entering the NBA, Pau Gasol quickly understood that he had stepped into a world where the values he carried were not seen as strengths, but as signs of vulnerability, where the label soft European was not just a scouting prejudice, but a mental sentence hanging over the head of every player from across the Atlantic. On the court, the physical collisions weren't just aimed at the body, but also at self-respect. Elbows thrown, jerseys tugged, unnecessary shoves accompanied by half-joking, half-serious remarks, meant to remind Pau that this wasn't Europe, that kindness wasn't considered strength, and silence was often interpreted as an admission of weakness. Every game was a physical test, but every practice and every locker room became a mental trial, where Pau had to hear people debate whether he was tough enough, fiery enough, worthy of playing center in a league that worshipped aggression. No one asked how he felt when weighed down by expectations and doubts. At the same time, no one cared that someone still not fluent in English had to try twice as hard just to be understood correctly, and no one noticed that behind that tall frame was a mind constantly questioning whether he was doing something wrong by not being able to get rougher. Pau learned to grit his teeth and endure, not because he believed pain would make him stronger, but because he understood that fighting back with words or emotions would only isolate him faster in an environment with no patience for differences. The hits got heavier, the injuries piled up gradually, but what wore Pau down the most was the quiet, spiritual humiliation when his efforts were dismissed simply because he didn't show them in the way the NBA was used to. In those moments, Pau realized a bitter truth. To survive, he had to learn to disappear a little, to shrink his inner voice, to accept that values like empathy, long-term thinking, and kindness would never be hung up on the stat sheet. He began adjusting himself subtly, not by changing his core self, but by covering it, wrapping himself in a calm that bordered on cold, where every emotional reaction was tightly controlled, so it wouldn't become a target for mockery. When knocked down, Pau got back up not to retaliate, but to prove he could endure, that he wouldn't leave the floor just because it hurt, and that very choice, while helping him survive, also pushed him further away from the part of himself that had been nurtured in openness and honesty. No one in the NBA asked Pau what it cost him to constantly prove he wasn't soft. No one cared about the mental toll of having to hold it together in silence. And Pau learned not to expect that understanding either, because every time he hoped to be heard, it only brought more disappointment. His second life took shape from moments like those: no single day, no clear decision, but the result of hundreds of small choices, choosing silence over explanation, endurance over resistance, survival over being himself. In a league where noise was seen as proof of guts, Pau chose the opposite path, not because he thought he was nobler, but because he understood it was the only way not to be completely crushed. But every silence like that was also one more step, pushing him farther from his true self, where kindness could no longer be lived fully, but was kept only as a private memory, stored deep inside. And from then on, the NBA became not just a stage for games, but the place where Pau Gasol learned the harshest lesson of his career. Sometimes, to survive, you have to accept that the things that make you who you are will never be seen by this world as strength. Memphis came to Pau Gasol like a ready-packaged opportunity wrapped in paradox, where he was handed the Rookie of the Year award, called the future face of a young team, but at the same time thrown into an inescapable spiral of losing, where every rare win only highlighted the surrounding helplessness even more. Individual honors came early, but they brought no protection. Instead, they made Pau an unwilling cornerstone for a team not ready to trust anyone, where responsibility was handed out faster than belief, and expectations always outstripped what a young European player could quietly carry. Memphis had no glamour, no tradition, no patience of a big market, just consecutive losing nights and a young star required to mature before he even understood what he was losing. Pau stepped into a leadership role not with loud voice or dominating gestures, but with dedication, consistency, and a desire to connect, but that very style of leadership made him doubted in an environment used to seeing leaders through growling and imposition. He carried the expectations of the coaching staff, local media, a city hungry to get its name on the NBA map, but was rarely protected when failures piled up, when teammates made mistakes, or when the system didn't create conditions for anyone to shine. In the locker room, Pau felt the distance clearly, not from lack of respect, but from a lack of real belief that he could lead them out of the darkness, and that doubt slowly seeped into him too, making every decision on the court heavier, every missed shot, not just a technical error, but repeated proof that he wasn't enough yet. Leading a group that doesn't believe in you is a form of loneliness hard to name, because you're still among everyone, but not truly standing with them. And Pau lived in that state throughout his years in Memphis, where he had to constantly prove his worth, while knowing the surrounding system wasn't strong enough to support any individual effort. Each season that passed, his personal stats looked better and better, but the team standings coldly reminded him that basketball is a team sport, and no individual, no matter how dedicated, could save a group not ready to save itself. On nights returning to an empty apartment, Pau began doubting not just his role in Memphis, but the value of his own person in this environment, wondering whether his kindness, patience, and quiet style of leadership were really what the NBA needed, or just a beautiful ideal unfit for harsh reality. That doubt didn't explode into crisis, but gnawed at him bit by bit, making joy from individual awards feel bland, turning every compliment into a counter-question. If I'm this good, why can't the team move forward? Personal success, instead of filling the void, exposed it more clearly, because Pau realized that being recognized while the team sank deeper into failure only heightened the sense of isolation, as if he were living a parallel life that couldn't touch the reality around him. He tried harder, practiced more, thought more, but each effort seemed only to push him further from the lightness a young player should feel, and in that process, Pau began to understand that leadership isn't just guiding others, it's also enduring doubt without being allowed to quit. Memphis became the place where he learned the bitter lesson that maturity doesn't always come with wins, and that sometimes you can do everything right, carry every assigned responsibility, but still can't save a team that hasn't found belief in itself. Those years didn't bring Pau major titles or glorious moments, but they left a deep scar in his mind, an emptiness that couldn't be filled with points or awards, only with the persistent question of whether the path he was on truly allowed him to be himself, or was just a series of trials forcing him to keep sacrificing, keep silent, and keep standing alone as a natural part of the leadership role he never asked for. The years in Memphis didn't just wear Pau Gasol down mentally, they also began leaving irreversible marks on his body, as if every game, every season, was a debt recorded straight into his bones and joints that he would sooner or later have to pay. Lingering foot pain, simmering inflammation in the knees, a lower back always in a state of tightness. These weren't explosive injuries that forced immediate exit from the court, but far more dangerous pain, because they allowed you to keep playing, to keep stepping onto the floor as if nothing had happened, while inside, the body quietly collapsed piece by piece. With his family's medical background and knowledge accumulated over the years, Pau wasn't like many teammates. He didn't need a doctor to explain what was happening. He knew exactly what each pain signaled, where biological limits were being crossed, that these repeating damages didn't disappear. They just waited for the right moment to return more viciously. The tragedy was that this understanding didn't give him the right to stop. It only made the decision to continue heavier, because every time he stepped on the court, Pau was fully aware he was trading his body's future to keep the present from collapsing. No one in the locker room asked what level of pain he was enduring, because in the NBA, pain is a default part of the job, and admitting it is sometimes seen as a sign of weakness he'd already grown too accustomed to avoiding. Pau learned to live with the pain, like background noise always present, but not allowed to take over his consciousness, because if he let himself feel it fully, he couldn't keep playing, couldn't keep leading, and couldn't keep holding the role he'd been placed in from early on. Practices ended in silence. Long nights with ice packs, mornings waking up, feeling his body heavier than the day before, became familiar rhythms. And in that rhythm, Pau understood that what flowed through him wasn't blood in the usual sense, but an invisible form of damage that left no clear bruises. Yet each day took away a piece of strength and joy. He stepped onto the court with a calm face, a controlled demeanor that outsiders often admired, but inside was a cold chain of calculations. How to land to reduce pressure on the knees, how to twist to avoid triggering back pain, how many more hits he could take before the body sent a stronger warning signal. Knowing the consequences but still having to continue, that's a tragedy without drama, because it unfolds in complete awareness, where every choice has a reason, and none is truly good. Pau didn't play in ignorance. He played in full understanding, and that very understanding made every season a personal, ethical equation. Continue to serve the team or stop to protect himself. When both choices carried guilt, he chose to continue not because he undervalued health, but because he didn't want to be seen as the one who quit in the eyes of those who had placed trust in him, even if that trust was sometimes never fully expressed. In Pau's world, pain wasn't shown through cries, but through increasingly restrained behavior, eating celebrations less, showing emotions less, and gradually retreating into a private space where only he and the limits being pushed back, little by little, existed. No one saw blood because it flowed inside. No one heard the breaking because it happened slowly and orderly, like a solid structure collapsing without a big bang, leaving only a cold emptiness at the end. Pau kept standing tall on the court, kept fulfilling his role, but each time he did so was also one more quiet acknowledgement that this body was no longer a safe refuge. It had become a battlefield where the mind had to control every movement to keep the collapse from spreading outward. In that silence, Pau learned another brutal lesson of his career, that sometimes the bravest thing isn't stepping onto the court despite the pain, but accepting that you're being deeply wounded without the right to stop, and continuing to live, continuing to play, continuing to fulfill the role, while knowing the price of this resilience will go unseen, unhonored, and perhaps understood only long after the final cheers have faded away. The trade in 2008 that took Pau Gasol away from Memphis didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a suspended sentence, where hope and fear were so tightly intertwined that you couldn't tell which was the reward and which was the punishment. The Los Angeles Lakers didn't wait for Pau like a saved soul. They waited for him like a piece that had to fit perfectly, no room for error, no time to waste, no allowance for softness. There, the lights were brighter, the noise louder, the history heavier, and every mistake got magnified into a public indictment. Pau figured out very quickly that the Lakers didn't need him to be nice, didn't need his empathy, didn't need the quiet intelligence that had helped him survive in Memphis. They needed him to endure, to sacrifice, to disappear at the right moment so the star could shine, and to appear at the exact instant to take the hits no one else wanted. The hope here was the chance to touch something he'd never had. Real team victory, but the fear was just as clear. One moment of hesitation, one soft play, 1 second of doubt, and he'd be labeled again, even worse this time, because now he was standing in the holy land of ruthlessness. The first losses, the first criticisms, the whispers that Pau was too soft, came so fast there was no time to adjust, and he realized that in the Lakers, time wasn't given. It had to be fought for with blood and silence. Pau had to bury his old self, the one who believed effort would speak for itself, to put on a new form where every collision was accepted as duty, every knockdown. A silent commitment that he'd get back up without demanding recognition. He learned to turn pain into an invisible signal, learned not to react to taunts, learned to let kindness survive in the shadows without interfering with performance. The Lakers didn't ask how he felt. They asked if he was ready to take another screen, if he dared stand in the dirtiest spot on the floor, if he could turn himself into a cushion so victory could bounce off it. And Pau answered with actions, because he understood this wasn't a chance to be loved. It was the final trial of his right to exist in the NBA. Every playoff series was a courtroom session, every matchup an indictment, where he was measured by the harshest standard. Was he tough enough not to get swallowed whole, disciplined enough to disappear when the scheme demanded it, sacrificial enough to accept that his name might not be the loudest when victory came? Pau knew that if he failed, all prior efforts would be rewritten as the story of a player who wasn't enough. And he also knew that if he succeeded, the price was the gradual erasure of his true self. He chose to keep going, not out of blind ambition, but because this was the point of no return. Stepping back meant admitting the years of endurance before had been meaningless. Under that pressure, Pau cut away the unnecessary parts of his identity, keeping only the bare minimum to survive: discipline, resilience, and a silence sharp as a blade. Every time the lights hit Staples Center, he stepped onto the floor with clear awareness that he was being judged not just by opponents, but by the history of a team unforgiving to anyone who didn't match its vision of greatness. There were no promises of salvation here, only strict conditions. Endure long enough, sacrifice deep enough, disappear at the right moments, and victory might come not as thanks, but as confirmation that he deserved to stay. So, the trade to the Lakers didn't open the gates to paradise. It slammed every escape route shut, putting Pau face to face with the raw truth that to survive at the top, he had to accept being ground down in public, had to let kindness exist as a private secret, and had to walk through the harshest trial of his career with trembling hands but no permission to stop, because this was the final judgment, and the verdict was singular. Either he survived by erasing himself, or he disappeared from a place that never made room for those who wanted to be themselves. If the Lakers were the harshest courtroom in Pau Gasol's career, then Kobe Bryant was the only judge with the power to deliver the final verdict, and he was a man famous for a ruthlessness that bordered on inhuman in the way he measured others' worth. Kobe didn't talk much to Pau in the early days, no explanations, no encouragement, no psychological escape routes. He observed, tested, and pushed Pau into situations where hesitation was punished instantly. On the practice court, Kobe shot cold stares whenever Pau shied from contact. In the locker room, he stayed silent while others spoke, letting the void say everything. It wasn't hatred, it was brutal screening, where only those who could handle wordless pressure earned the right to stay. Pau figured out fast that this wasn't a relationship that needed explanations, because Kobe didn't care where you came from, what education you had, or what values you carried. The only thing he needed to know was whether you were willing to pay the price and how much. So, the tension between them didn't explode into arguments, it simmered, more intense than any shout. As every missed play from Pau was scrutinized under doubting lights, every soft moment seen as proof of lacking commitment. Kobe tested Pau to the limit, not with public yelling, but by putting him in the dirtiest spots of the game, where he had to absorb elbows, take hits without complaining, and stand in positions where any mistake would land on him first. For Pau, it was a sophisticated form of mental violence, because he wasn't allowed to respond in his familiar way. Every resistance had to become action, and every action had to meet the standard of someone who believed only in winning. There were nights Pau went home, feeling ground down to the bone, wondering if continuing to endure was still the right choice, or just delaying the inevitable failure. But every next morning, he still stepped onto the court, not to prove anything to Kobe, but to prove to himself that he could exist in a space not made for gentleness. Acceptance, when it came, didn't arrive as praise or a hug. It came as another silence, heavier, deeper, when Kobe began to trust that Pau would be in the right spot when needed, would take the hardest job without reminder, and wouldn't vanish when pressure peaked. In that moment, Pau understood there was no way back, because Kobe's acceptance wasn't a reward, it was a binding obligation. From now on, he had to live up to that standard in every situation, no permission to revert to the old self that once sought safety in reason. Those two men found each other not in joy or celebration, but in shared pain, in the harshest way possible. One learning to be less ruthless in order to trust, the other learning to toughen up without losing his core. On the court, they complemented each other like two opposing poles forced to coexist. Kobe the blade slicing through every hesitation, Pau the quiet anchor keeping the structure from collapsing, and in that opposition, the Lakers found the shape of a championship team. But the price of that harmony was far from small, because Pau had to accept that from the moment Kobe recognized him, no mistake would be forgiven, and no pain could be shown. He had passed the trial, but the sentence came with an irrevocable responsibility, where every next game was a reminder that this acceptance could be revoked any time if he faltered. They found each other in pain, and that very pain became the strongest bond, because it wasn't based on personality or emotion, but on a stark truth. Only those willing to endure to the end earned the right to stand beside each other at the top. For Pau, that relationship was both the deepest recognition of his career and the deepest scar on his identity, because from then on, he didn't just fight opponents, he had to live up to the image Kobe had seen, one forged from sacrifice, silence, and an unbreakable will. And in that journey, two seemingly opposite men met at the only common point: pain as the truest language of victory. The 2009 and 2010 seasons passed like a whirlwind, lifting Pau Gasol to the peak he'd reached with everything he had, but also taking more from him than anyone could see. On the history board, they were two brilliant NBA championships for the Los Angeles Lakers. On the floor, they were playoff runs where Pau became the living cornerstone, the tempo keeper, the gap filler, the one standing in the heaviest contact zones so the structure wouldn't collapse. He did things that didn't always make the highlights: precise positional defense, screens without fear of pain, reading plays to free teammates, staying calm when the game's rhythm turned chaotic. In decisive moments, he was there. In chaotic times, he was the anchor. But because of that role, full recognition never came. When victories were retold, the story often wrapped around brighter frames, louder icons, while Pau stepped back, as if his existence was a given that didn't need mentioning. He understood that from the start, and he accepted it, because the price of staying at the top was continuing to sacrifice parts of himself, continuing to disappear at the right times, so victory could be named in history's familiar way. But that acceptance brought no peace. Every playoff round was a prolonged ordeal, where an already weary body had to tense up even more, where simmering pains became inseparable companions, where every morning started with the question of how far his body would allow him to go that day. Victory came with exhaustion, and the joy of the trophy didn't erase the emptiness when the arena lights went out, when the cheers faded, when the room went quiet, and only one man remained, with aching joints and a mind not allowed to collapse. Pau didn't seek pity, but he also couldn't pretend the titles had the power to heal years of accumulated damage. Each championship ring was a confirmation of the sacrifice, and at the same time, a reminder that the price had been paid in full and couldn't be refunded. On post-game nights, when tape was unwrapped and ice placed on familiar sore spots, Pau understood that winning couldn't undo what was lost. It only put a beautiful name on the suffering to make everything look more meaningful. That lack of peace grew clearer when he realized that even at the peak, he still had to keep proving not to opponents, but to prejudice that his kindness didn't mean weakness, that his intelligence wasn't hesitation, that his silence wasn't lack of desire. The two championships didn't give Pau an emotional refuge. They only etched deeper the path he'd chosen, where recognition came late and incomplete, where victory was built with invisible bricks named sacrifice. When the season ended and the city celebrated, Pau still did what he'd always done: step back, withdraw, keep the structure from collapsing, and carry the fatigue no one asked him to share. The titles didn't heal the wounds, because Pau's wounds weren't from lacking wins. They were from having to pay continuously to maintain an image that fit a world unaccustomed to valuing the quiet. And in the silence, after those 2 brilliant years, he began to grasp a hard truth. Some peaks only give you a place to stand, not a place to rest. Some victories only prove you've endured long enough. With no promise, the pain will leave. The 2 championships wrote Pau Gasol into history, but they brought no peace, because peace is something that can't be handed out with a silver trophy. It can only come when a person no longer has to disappear for others to shine. And at that moment, that was still out of his reach. After the 2 championships, when the parade celebrations ended and the lights slowly faded from Staples Center, Pau Gasol realized something painful that he'd sensed for a long time. The history that America likes to tell doesn't leave much room for quiet people. American media quickly turned back to their most familiar images, to the easiest stories to remember, where victory is always tied to one central face, one icon who can represent an entire era. And in that framework, Kobe Bryant is the name repeated, honored, etched deep as the sole soul of those glorious years. Pau, who stood right beside him in the most decisive moments, was gradually pushed to the edge of the story, mentioned as the perfect piece, the ideal supporter, phrases that sound respectful but unintentionally erase the vital role he carried. No one told his story fully. No one stopped to ask what he'd had to trade to become that support. And no one really cared what those wins would have looked like without his stability, intelligence, and sacrifice. In the collective memory shaped by headlines and highlight reels, Pau began to fade not because he played worse, but because he didn't fit the lone hero archetype that American sports culture loves. He didn't fight it, didn't try to rewrite the story, didn't speak up to claim his fair share, because throughout his career, Pau had grown used to letting actions speak for themselves, used to believing that time would sort everything out. But time isn't always fair, and silence, even when it comes from character, has its price. Every time a Lakers history recap skipped his name or mentioned him only as a side note, Pau felt clearly the sensation of being glossed over not as anger, but as a simmering sadness, because he understood his story had been simplified almost to the point of vanishing. He accepted being forgotten not because he believed he didn't deserve to be remembered, but because he didn't want to disrupt the order he'd helped maintain, didn't want to become the one demanding the spotlight, when that spotlight was never meant for someone like him. In that silence, Pau paid the price of not speaking up, as the story of kindness, sacrifice, and intelligence gradually sank beneath louder, more digestible narratives. He kept playing, kept fulfilling his role, but understood he was slowly moving away from the center of shared memory, becoming part of the foundation. Others stood on a necessary structure, but one that went unseen. That price wasn't just the absence of praise. It was the feeling of being stripped of the right to have his own journey retold, when what he'd endured, what he'd sacrificed, what he'd carried was no longer mentioned as essential parts of the bigger picture. Pau didn't resent it, because resentment requires energy he no longer wanted to spend. But that acceptance didn't bring peace either, because deep inside, the question lingered. Was the silence truly noble, or just another way to erase himself from the story he'd sweated and bled to write? Being glossed over in collective memory wasn't a sudden shock. It was a slow process, where each passing season took away another piece of his presence in the public mind. And Pau watched it with the sad calm of someone who understood that the price of not speaking up isn't just being forgotten, it's letting others define your worth in the way most convenient for them. And in that quiet, he kept living true to his nature, refusing to change to be remembered more, accepting that some victories exist only in stat sheets, while the people who made them gradually fade into history's background, like a familiar shadow no longer called by name. After leaving the center of the Lakers' story, Pau Gasol stepped into a chapter where everything became smaller, quieter, and painful in a different way. Chicago Bulls, San Antonio Spurs, then Milwaukee Bucks, weren't harbors of hope or rebirth. They were stopping points for a body pushed to its limits, where Pau existed as a necessary role player no longer built around. There, he was no longer the cornerstone, no longer the protected piece. He was someone brought in to fill a gap, share experience, stand in the right spot when called, then step back, as soon as the game's pace demanded youth. His body was depleted now, not from lack of effort, but from having paid off enough of the debts accumulated from Memphis to Los Angeles, from long playoff runs to nights of ice packs that were never mentioned. Pau knew exactly where he stood on the career curve. He didn't need anyone to tell him time was no longer on his side, because every morning when he woke up, his body said it before his mind could deny it. Shorter sprints, more cautious landings, safer decisions weren't signs of fear. They were proof of someone who understood too well the consequences of stubbornness. Honor, everything he'd built from the past, wasn't enough to save the present anymore, because honor doesn't ease pain, doesn't extend athletic lifespan, and doesn't return what's been lost. Pau didn't cling to roles, didn't complain about minutes, didn't turn himself into an emotional burden for any team he passed through, because he believed some battles should end before they turn into resentment. Learning to walk away before being resented is a different kind of courage, far harder than clinging until you're pushed out, because it demands accepting reality, while pride is still strong enough to resist. In Chicago, he accepted the unwilling role of teacher, sharing wisdom quietly. In San Antonio, he entered a disciplined system where everything was in place, but no longer revolved around him. In Milwaukee, he understood he was only a temporary piece in a picture being painted by younger hands. Every jersey change was another self-inflicted cut to the illusion that he still had time, that he could return to center stage if he tried just a little harder. He didn't do that not from lack of desire, but because he'd lived long enough to know desire can't beat biology. This kind of pain wasn't loud, had no collapse moments on camera. It was conscious withdrawal, where you gradually narrow your scope of existence to preserve your core character. Pau hurt watching others run faster, jump higher, collide without thinking about tomorrow. But he hurt more knowing he no longer belonged to that pace, that pushing beyond limits now would only make the ending uglier. He chose silence, chose to fulfill the role, chose to step back, and in each choice was an unspoken goodbye. No one demanded he prove toughness anymore. No one needed him to take the heaviest hits. But that very absence created a mental void hard to fill. Because for Pau, basketball wasn't just a job. It was the language he'd used to survive for 3 decades. As that language was slowly taken away, he had to learn silence in a deeper sense, where retreat was no longer a court tactic, but a life-or-death decision for the rest of his days. Body broken, honor no salvation. And Pau accepted it with a calm sorrow, because he understood some endings can't be honored. They can only be accepted, and that sometimes the most painful way to keep dignity is to leave on your own before the world turns its back. The accident in January 2020 didn't come to Pau Gasol as ordinary bad news. It came as a direct blow to the soul, where every layer of defense he'd built over 30 years collapsed instantly. When Kobe Bryant left, Pau didn't just lose a teammate, he lost the only person in the NBA world who'd truly seen through him, understood what didn't need saying, and validated what was never recorded in the stat sheet. Kobe was the one who'd forced Pau to toughen up, but also the only one who understood that toughness wasn't his nature. It was a survival shell. When Kobe vanished, Pau felt like a part of his life had been torn out of the timeline. Not the brilliant part the public remembered, but the quiet part, where two men had found each other in pain and harsh discipline. That loss wasn't loud, had no long statements, just a cold void opening inside, where every memory of the Lakers, of playoff nights, of collisions and silence, suddenly became too real, too close, with no one left to share the burden. Pau understood that with Kobe, the first half of his life, the part defined by enduring to be accepted, had also closed in a brutal way. No one left with the spiritual authority to say those sacrifices were real, that he'd done enough, that he'd paid the right price. In the sports world, where collective memory is shaped by other storytellers, Pau suddenly stood alone with his own story. No witness, no companion, no one who fully grasped the meaning of the years he'd erased himself so victory could happen. The most painful and truest act was when Pau decided to name his daughter Gianna, not as a public symbolic gesture, but as a private, quiet, tear-filled vow that he would carry that memory forward when the other man no longer could. It wasn't gentle remembrance. It was a way to keep the wound open, always reminding that some bonds formed in pain never heal. Every time he called his daughter's name, Pau wasn't just calling a child, he was calling an entire lost chapter, a person who'd once stood across from him in silence and understood him better than any media praise. Kobe's departure also took the last thing Pau still clung to, the feeling that someone truly knew how much he'd endured to survive in the NBA. No one left to confirm he wasn't soft, that kindness wasn't weakness, that what he'd traded away was no small thing. That cut never closed, because it wasn't in memory, it was in the present, in how Pau walked slower, spoke less, and carried a deep, unnamed sorrow. Kobe left, and at the same time, Pau understood that, from now on, he would have to live with his story without any companion close enough to fully understand. No one left to validate what he'd endured, no one to share the weight of victories built on silence, and no one for him to look at and know he hadn't lived in vain. That accident didn't just take a basketball legend. It took the final link between Pau Gasol and the version of himself he'd had to become to survive, to win, and to stay in a world that had never truly made space for people like him. Retirement came to Pau Gasol not like a grand closing ceremony, but like a long afternoon, where the noise slowly withdrew, leaving one man standing before himself with no more reasons to hide. There was no big stage, no promises of return, no need to prove anything further, because Pau understood that all the evidence had been submitted long ago, it just had never been called by its right name. As basketball stepped back, he returned to family, to warm kitchens, slow mornings, and stories that didn't have to end in victory. He returned to humanitarian work, to medicine paths that had run parallel inside him for 3 decades, not to chase new titles, but to reconnect the life thread he'd been forced to interrupt. Pau spent time in hospitals, with children, on projects where his presence wasn't measured by cheers, but by one more person being heard. Ironically, he learned to heal others while he himself remained unhealed, because some wounds don't need to close to keep living. They just need to be looked at straight without fear anymore. The two lives, the silent warrior life and the compassionate human life, began colliding head-on, with no court left to separate them, no game schedule to delay the conversation. On long nights, with no tomorrow's game to prepare for, Pau faced the question he'd once avoided. Were those sacrifices truly choices, or just survival reflexes in a world that didn't allow him to exist any other way? He had no regrets, but he didn't lull himself either. He accepted that some parts of life were set aside before they could bloom, that some words were never spoken because silence had been the condition for staying. So retirement didn't bring instant peace. It opened a gray zone, where memories, responsibilities, and compassion overlapped, forcing him to learn a new skill harder than any defensive system: staying still with himself. Pau began using his voice differently, not to argue, but to protect, not to convince, but to connect. And in that process, he realized strength isn't only in enduring, but also in allowing himself to soften without shame. The two lives once apart now stood in the same place, looking at each other without hostility, only with belated acknowledgement that both were necessary for him to reach today. The question, "Did I live right?" doesn't demand a neat answer. It stays like a new companion, reminding him that rightness isn't always confirmed by silver cups or golden boards. Sometimes it's measured only by the ability to keep loving when there's nothing left to prove. And in that quiet, Pau Gasol stepped into a different rhythm of life. Not faster, not louder, but more honest with who he had been and who he was still learning to become. Only after Pau Gasol left the floor, when the squeak of shoes no longer echoed on hardwood and the numbers stopped climbing, did the world slowly begin to look back at him with a different gaze, deeper and less hurried. Retrospective articles appeared. Belated discussions started admitting that Pau wasn't just a skilled center, not just the perfect support, but a true icon of the modern European player, the one who paved the way, took the hits, and stood firm in a league that once didn't believe finesse could coexist with power. When later generations mentioned the journeys of successful international stars in the NBA, Pau Gasol's name gradually found its rightful place as an indispensable milestone, proof that intelligence, discipline, and kindness can exist at the top if the person carrying them is willing to pay the price. But that recognition came too late, after Pau no longer needed it to keep going, after the years of endurance couldn't be undone, after his body already bore enough scars from a career worn down in silence. He didn't step forward to demand history be rewritten, didn't edit the story to favor himself more, because Pau understood that calling for belated fairness sometimes only highlights the gaps that can't be filled. Instead, he left behind a heavy silence, not as avoidance, but as a reminder that some legacies don't need loud declarations to exist. Pau's legacy lies in how people began to see European players differently, in the subtle shift of leadership standards that don't require growling, in the realization that sacrifice doesn't always need to be shouted to have value. When jerseys are hung, when his name is mentioned again in history discussions, Pau still keeps his familiar posture one step back, yielding the spotlight to the bigger story, because throughout his playing life, he learned to let his role be understood through impact, not through voice. That silence, therefore, isn't empty. It holds everything he chose not to say over 3 decades: the pain, the endurance, and the belief that true value will reveal itself when there's nothing left to fight for. Being understood late doesn't hurt Pau more, but it leaves a quiet feeling for anyone looking back, that some people have to walk very far in the dark for the eventual light to illuminate the path for others. And in that quiet, Pau Gasol doesn't stand at the center of celebration. He stands as a long shadow of history, not flashy, not demanding quietly, proving that sometimes the most enduring contributions are the ones only recognized after their maker has stepped out of the noise. Today, Pau Gasol is still here, still alive, still sharp-minded, still with family beside him, still with quiet mornings and evenings free from calculating tomorrow's game schedule. He remains clear-headed enough to recall every stage of the journey, calm enough to need no further proof, and compassionate enough to keep giving care to others. But precisely today, Pau has no court left, no rhythm that once defined his existence, and no one who truly fully understands the price he paid to stand firm for 30 years in a world never designed for people like him. When the shoes fell silent, when the lights went out, Pau faced another kind of loneliness deeper and quieter, because there's no more Kobe, no more locker room, no more moments where silence was shared without explanation. The two lives that once ran parallel inside him, the warrior forced to toughen up for survival, and the quiet man carrying intelligence, kindness, and empathy, finally merged into one, not in glorious victory, but in prolonged silence, where there's no longer reason to keep them apart. No miracle happens here. No epiphany moment erases the scars on his body or the voids in his mind. Pau isn't redeemed from what he endured, because life doesn't run on fair repayment logic. He didn't win in the way stories usually tell, not for lack of titles, but because those titles were never enough to return the parts of himself that were traded away. All that's left is one man who paid enough for kindness in an environment that treated kindness as something to hide. He stood, that's all. He stood after years of doubt, erosion, being glossed over in collective memory, stood after his body no longer allowed chasing the old pace, stood when the only one who ever understood him in silence left forever. He seeks no pity, expects no belated honor. He simply keeps living, slowly, like someone who understands value isn't in how many times you're named, but in what you still hold after all the noise fades. In his current life, Pau devotes time to family, to humanitarian work, to medicine and education pieces once set aside. But every action carries traces of an unerasable past where he learned to give when he'd never received enough in return. No one stands beside him anymore to confirm he endured the right amount, that those sacrifices were real, that the silence wasn't avoidance, but perhaps the very absence of anyone to confirm is the truest form of this ending. The two lives no longer fight for existence. They stand together in one weary but unbowed body, looking back at the road traveled without needing justification. No miracle comes to lighten the burden of memory. No redemption erases the deep wounds. Only one person remains experienced enough not to resent, pained enough not to sugarcoat, kind enough not to turn pain into noise. Pau Gasol didn't win, because victory always requires a clear loser. And in this story, there's no one to defeat except himself. He simply remains standing between past and present, between what was lost and what remains, like quiet proof that sometimes the bravest thing isn't winning, but continuing to live fully aware of the price paid and still choosing not to betray the kindness that made the path so difficult from the start. Pau Gasol's story leaves behind a quiet sadness, not loud, but persistent, because this isn't the tragedy of a man who fell, but the tragedy of a man who stood too long with no room left to fall. The deepest ache isn't in the career-long foot, knee, or back injuries, but in Pau, knowing exactly every damage he was accumulating, yet still having to continue because the NBA didn't allow kindness to exist unless wrapped in endurance. The 2009-2010 championships, where Pau played a vital role but always stepped back from the spotlight, expose a bitter truth of achievement culture. Team victory doesn't guarantee individual recognition, especially for those who choose silence over self-promotion. The trade to the Lakers, the harsh but understanding relationship with Kobe Bryant, then the 2020 shock. When Kobe left, all show Pau didn't just lose a friend. He lost the only witness who fully understood the mental price of that sacrifice. Naming his daughter Gianna wasn't a media symbol, it was a private, painful act, etching memory and responsibility deep. Retiring quietly, returning to family, humanitarian work, and medicine, Pau continues healing others while still unhealed himself, a beautiful but sad paradox. The lesson for Americans from this story is society shouldn't only celebrate loud voices and bright images. Lasting value is often built by quiet people carrying the load. Success doesn't exempt loneliness, and silence, even when noble, has a price. Learning to recognize, protect mental health, and respect unflashy contributions is how the community becomes more humane. So people like Pau Gasol don't have to pay enough price for their kindness. If the quiet but deeply dignified story of Pau Gasol made you pause and reflect, please hit subscribe to the channel to keep joining us on journeys as real as this one. Thank you for listening all the way to the end, and see you in the next video where we'll continue telling stories that aren't loud but deserve to be remembered.